Hello and welcome everyone to the Learning Zone podcast, the podcast that takes learning seriously, but not itself. Rob, how are you doing today?
Good, Rob. I had a really good week and had a lot of time to reflect and take stock of what we're doing. Got really deep into extracting some learnings from a recent book I read, the No Rules Rules from Reed Hastings and the Netflix story, which I found really insightful. And enjoying, as I said last week, a lot of what's happening in the Olympics. And I feel like things are heating up, not only from a weather standpoint, but from a work standpoint. We've all been pretty busy, some interesting client engagements, and we've had quite a cold winter. But I think spring is fast approaching, and spring where we live in Johannesburg, in the northern part of South Africa, is probably the best part of the year. Jacaranda's in full blossom, and the whole city turns purple through the flowers that blossom on the end of the trees. Yeah.
And there we go, Rob. We've just reached a milestone. We've checked in by talking about the weather. I must say, every day I think we get older and older. Eh? We're basically one stage away from using walkers to get around when we start checking in with the weather. Eh?
And I think it's also a sign weather often becomes just the perfect filler. Like, what am I going to share with our listeners? And let me just go to how warm it's been of late. So apologies
everyone has
for
it
that.
in common. Yeah, everyone has weather, but differently. I mean, it's a real common ground.
Holding me to account. Is that are you going the old age angle just because I'm 8 years older than you?
You are 8 years, but you look 8 years younger, and that's all that matters.
Oh, thank you, Rob. What do you think? What do you think contributes to that?
It's probably your diet and exercise, and the fact that you only have one kid so far. I think with the next kid, that's definitely going to change that for you.
Cool. I think it's what gives away my age potentially is the fact that I shave the sides of my hair quite short, so you can't see all the grey hair there. But they're coming thick and fast.
That is true. You do have the haircut of a young rapper, I must say. So obviously it's great talking about the haircut and weather on a podcast, but what we want to just briefly talk about today, I think on this episode, is a recent presentation I gave at our national conference. We have a national conference of organizational psychologists. I've been a contributor there for the last 5 years. And this year in particular, we tackled a new topic, myself and a colleague of mine, Dr. Ruwain Koch, around allyship. And allyship's a really interesting topic that we want to jump into today because it's in vogue, it's talked about, but with anything that becomes popular, it's also popular in being misinterpreted and misconstrued. So, allyship is really what I want to double click on today. And before we get into it, Rob, with some of the myths around it, some of the personal stories, what's your journey with allyship been, or what comes to mind when you hear the word allyship?
Well, it's interesting, Rob. We've had many conversations about this, and particularly our lens into allyship, particularly both coming from developmentally through all boys boarding schools, which is quite unique in South Africa, and trying to consciously fit in and be acknowledged and accepted. And there's a lot of bravado and never being seen as vulnerable or exposing your weaknesses or things that you aren't so good at. But fundamentally, allyship is often defined as people in advantageous positions supporting those with less advantage to either achieve outcomes, objectives, or a desired change that they may have. And I think it links very closely allyship to a degree of power or privilege that you may have in any context, and how you help use that power or privilege to give people access to opportunities they may not have through being in a lower level position on many facets. And I say lower level position, that could be through status, through power, through whatever it may be within that context.
Rob, and I think that's definitely a great, general understanding of the term. And I think where a lot of people may be in the allyship journey, but it's very interesting, right? Because allyship is not something that people would be against, right? Because anyone who considers themselves a good leader would be an ally. Of course, I'm an ally. I'm a good leader. I'm a good person. Of course, I'm woke. I'm an ally, right? But what does it really mean, And I'll be honest, I'm quite conflicted, because how do I talk about allyship without becoming the great white hope, right? With this whole white savior thing that often gets thrown around as well. There's also a landmine field as well, because am I trying to swoop in to save people? Do people even want to be saved? Is that even the right mentality about it? And how do I navigate this clumsy conversation, and that's what I explored with my colleague at the national conference a couple of weeks ago, and it was a really riveting discussion, because we just really honest and vulnerable around it, And I must say, what's so important about allyship and why it's gaining traction is it seems to be one of the puzzle pieces to equity, diversity, and inclusion in diverse teams that people aren't acknowledging yet. We talk about bias, we talk about inclusion, but what is the role of power dynamics of privilege and power, and how do we break down those systems of being an ally for one, an ally for some, and an ally for all, and realizing how systemically and systematically our processes aren't really equitable. A great example is the women's uniforms at the Olympics, right? It took people quite a while up until 2021 to realize, yeah, the woman playing in semi G-strings, because some of them are very, very scantily clad, it's not really fair or equal. And it's really built by a systemic inequality and a male-dominated perceptions of sport. And all of that is perpetuated throughout humanity. And I don't want to go into the sociology and humanness and inclusion in work, but we need to start realizing where there's inequity. And a lot of it, comes with ourselves. And I think that's actually the first part of it, is understanding equity. So I remember having some banter with you earlier in the month around equity, and you talking about, well, how many shares is that in equity, right? Because I know you are the commercial guy in the business. You talk about equity and shares, and you are the one that does the big deals. So that is always top of mind for you. But equity in this lens is really about understanding of, do we have fair access to resources and opportunities? And that talks with privilege, right? So people would often say, I'm privileged, I get it, but privilege can be triggering, because if we acknowledge privilege, we say, well, I work hard, I'm not privileged, I don't have an unfair advantage. But what's really useful to have in that kind of conversation is not necessarily that you have an unfair advantage, which in actual case you do. You actually have an absence of the disadvantages that other people face. And when that really came to light for me, that understanding was an interaction I had with my sister years ago. I mean, this must have been about 8 years ago. She was studying. I was living in, I don't think, a bad area of town here in Johannesburg. And she was coming to visit me, and she was staying about a 40-minute drive away at a university. And it got to about 6 or 7 p.m. in the evening. And it was my brother and my sister, we were all staying together. And my sister was debating whether or not she stays for dinner or she goes home now. And I thought to her, no, Jess, I barely see you, just stay for dinner. And she was like, no, Rob, I can't leave at night when it's 7 p.m. Because the neighborhood you live in is not safe. And I was like, what do you mean? Geez, come on, man. I don't live in like a dodgy gangster-ridden neighborhood. I mean, I walk around it all the time. But she said to me, no, you don't understand. I'm a girl, I'm small in stature, and I'm in a car by myself. I can't drive it home at night, especially with all these robots and areas where it could be a threat. And I thought to myself, that barrier of gender or size and stature is not an obstacle I have. It's not something I ever think about. I've never thought about visiting someone at a certain time of night and then not being able to drive because I might be a victim of theft or sexual assault. It's not even in my reality. And that's really one of the biggest ahas or, glass shattering moments that I've had in my understanding of equity and allyship and access to privilege, power, and advantage. It's not only about recognizing the greater access you have of advantage, privilege, or power, but it's also understanding of what you have as less barriers that other people have. And I've never had to worry about my gender holding me back from driving late at night.
Yeah, that's such a great story. And I think when you speak about equity and fairness, the way you achieve that is through allyship. People in power or people in a state of privilege being able to uplift those who maybe wouldn't have access to those opportunities or to resources or to just giving their perspective as often as they would like. And I think also, Rob, we've touched on this with many businesses. Many organizations get it wrong around equity and equality. Equity is much more easily achieved. And equity speaks to fairness, as you said. But equality actually speaks to sameness, and it's to a lesser extent not as easily achieved. And when we start looking at allyship from many angles, I think we start seeing how many organizations aren't acknowledging the importance of allyship in achieving their organizational goals and objectives. So I think it's a very, very pertinent topic. And if I think of how often, I mean, if we just use the loose example of on WhatsApp group chats that some of us are on, or in social forums that we're in, when someone within our close social sphere or in a group chat that we're on says something that we know intrinsically is not part of our moral fiber and fabric, and we get frustrated with it, when we elect not to speak up, but we send a smiley face or a laughing emoji, that in actual fact we're complicit, and in actual fact many people think we're in agreement with what's been said. And more often than not, if someone stands up and speaks up from an allyship standpoint and says, that's not something acceptable and not something you should be saying, almost in every occurrence, everyone says the same. Yeah, but that's, or mate, that's not something you should be saying. Or, sorry, Joanne or a friend, that's not something that's very fair in relation to what's been mentioned. And I think that's a big piece of allyship. More often than not, people are on the same page as you. And how are you using your privilege and power to make that common and known, broadly speaking?
Yeah, Rob, when you figure out how to do it, let me know, man. I always struggle with that when I'm involved in various WhatsApp groups, and I struggle, because if you speak up, it feels like you're spoiling the fun. So you decide not to encourage the humor, maybe like sexist, someone posts a meme and it says, like a great example is like, I don't need to buy a dishwasher. I have a wife at home, right? This kind of like, really masculine humor. And it's like, I did laugh at it, in the early stages, but now I realize that's really perpetuating gender stereotypes. And I want to raise a daughter one day, and I don't want her to be treated like that. But yet, do I feel safe to say in the WhatsApp group, like, hey guys, not cool, not a great statement to have, and how do we really wrestle that? I mean, I definitely, going to an all boys school, we definitely used homophobic slurs. I mean, it was part of growing up. We didn't know that was problematic. Now, later in life, I'm realizing how problematic that was. But if someone were to say, don't use those words in your common vernacular, I'd be like, well, such a weird guy, and you're definitely not a friend I want to be associated with. So it's also like understanding what do we do daily that is systemically perpetuating that inequality, and how can we advocate for others? And another interesting point around allyship that was transformational in my understanding is that everyone can be an ally and everyone needs an ally. I mean, I'm white male, able-bodied, heterosexual. I've almost won the white privilege lottery in a way. So, I often think it's like, what can I do for others? But I've been at the benefit of being an ally. And I was giving you that example the other day where, I was sharing when we were meeting with our directors and our shareholders, and they live a very different lifestyle to what I'm used to with regards to holidays and expensive clothes and everything else. And I realized we're having drinks after one of the meetings, and they were having a drink of wine, and they were all getting into these shared experiences. I'm fairly new to the team, and they all just talked for about 20 minutes without me saying a single thing about their shared experiences of traveling and expensive, things that they buy. And then one of the members of the team, I think, subtly realized that I'd been quite quiet for a time and I'm insanely extroverted. And she kind of brought me into the conversation, realizing that they have access to privilege and power of being in a team for a long period of time. I'm new, and my voice necessarily heard, but she brought me into the conversation, and I felt like I benefited from allyship and that micro habit or example. And it's not just about race and gender, which are the big inequalities that come to mind. It's also about being people that are more in the in group, less in the out group, either from commonality, from exposure or experience, newbies in the team versus the old dogs that are there for quite some time. There's various levels to, privilege and power. And everyone needs an ally, and everyone can be an ally.
I love that. And I think you've spoken, what you're alluding to there is your ability to be an ally, and the fact that I think what you're going to touch on is it's about being conscious of it to the extent that you take action when it's required. More often than not, you'll just sit by the wayside and let it occur. And I think we've mentioned, what you've touched on too, is that when you are not an ally to those around you in your immediate context, particularly in business, more often than not, you excluding people to the detriment of them being involved, motivated, fulfilled, and engaged in many, many facets. When you make someone an ally, they often go above and beyond for you and for the goals that you're trying to achieve. And you then create a really sound in-group where everyone's driven towards achieving their own goals, but also goals that benefit you indirectly. And I think that's one of the amazing things that I've learned from you and in the work that we're starting to do in the allyship space with organizations.
I think that it's also another big piece around being an ally creates more psychological safety for people to be themselves. And I recently had an interaction with an executive team, and we had a lot of banter around rugby and sport, which is natural for me. I mean, I like rugby, and I can definitely build relatedness quite quickly. And then afterwards, as we got into the meeting, I said, but how inclusive is that? How inclusive is that conversation? Does everyone like rugby here? We have multiple countries that are represented on the call from around the world, or do we have to almost fake that we like rugby to have a voice at the table? And I definitely had that. For example, I don't like cricket. And in a previous role, I worked in an environment where everyone loved cricket, and I found myself reading up on cricket and the scores from the weekend. So when the guys had that banter around the table, I could kind of, have a voice at the table and be heard and be included. And that, that's often what people call covering or cognitive assimilation, or essentially changing myself to fit in. And imagine if we had enough allies making it psychologically safe for people to be themselves, we would waste less time trying to fit in and have more cognitive capacity to just do our jobs and be great.
Yeah, and I think that cognitive taxing piece and the emotional impact on many individuals and organizations is far greater than we could care to imagine or even understand. I think, what the example you've just alluded to around an executive speaking explicitly about rugby and their passion for it, and then through those who have a similar passion for the sport engaging. It happened to me once when I had a boss and a number of the team were from the United Kingdom, and they were avid Formula One fans. Now, I've never really, it's the one sport that I don't have a deep understanding of. But whenever outside of work initiatives or what we were planning to deliver on work-wise, the conversation would flip to Formula One on the weekend, and I was immediately excluded. And then I felt like whether I slink away, or do I now go to the bathroom, or do I take a break because I couldn't contribute. And it was amazing how I then also felt like if I'm going to really fit in with these guys on a deeper level and build some rapport and a deeper relationship with them, I'm really going to have to invest in understanding a lot more about Formula One, which I think speaks volumes for what are we doing unconsciously, which makes people feel more excluded. And I know we're going down an exclusionary, alleyway here, but I think allyship and being an ally to people ultimately creates greater inclusion.
It does. And it seems to be this puzzle piece that's not being talked about. And I'll just give one piece of data that really struck a chord with me is that, up until 2016, that was the last piece of data that I saw in this research. And then there was a meta study prior. They assessed the perception of people that speak up for diversity. And they found that if people spoke up or advocated for diversity, they were perceived to be lower performers. they always seem to be less serious about their jobs if they were speaking up for diversity. And the last piece of research was published in 2016, and I think that's reflective of the times. I think in 2021, if someone speaks up for diversity, which all the CEOs are doing right now, you're not seen as a poor performer because the CEO is speaking about it, right? Because the C-suite, the executive is speaking about it. And that's a form of allyship, because those people that have access to privilege and power are now talking about it. It is raising the conversation and making us safe for everyone else to speak about it as well. And I think it's really the right time for allyship. It's also the right time to try and experiment and figure it out. And I think if we talk about takeaways out of this episode, I mean, it's really about understanding that everyone can be an ally, everyone needs an ally, and there's a lot of clumsy conversations to have where we could be unintentionally creating an environment that is not inclusive and where people need to fit in.
Yeah, I love that. And, I think we spoke in the last episode around getting hybrid work and this new hybrid world of work right. And we spoke about empathy. And I think a leader or manager or anyone in business who starts becoming an ally in any shape or form is to some extent showing genuine care, compassion, and a greater concern for how they support others. And I think that's always essentially giving others who have lesser access to opportunities or resources a foot up, so to speak. And the benefits are, I think, are have multiple, example. There are multiple benefits to it, should I say?
We can all be an ally, and we all need an ally. I think it's something for a lot of people to dig into, to look at, and to have those difficult conversations. And maybe the next time someone says something ambiguous in a WhatsApp group, maybe rethink about just being silent and not supportive, and maybe take a stand. Rob, that's all I wanted to share today. It was a great conversation in the last couple of weeks around this topic. I'm glad we could have an episode on it. And I think it's something that we should talk about more in the future when we have the opportunity to do so.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks to our listeners. We'll chat soon.
Goodbye for now.